am presenting Union Gospel Press's Sunday School Lesson number 6, Sunday, July 9th, 2023. The lesson is entitled, Accept God's Invitation. Lesson text comes from Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 11, and verses 15 through 24. Related scriptures are Proverbs 25, 6 through 7, Matthew 21, 42 through 44, and 22, 1 through 14. The place is Perea. The time is 30 A.D. Our lesson this week reminds us of our obligation as Christians to do all we can to bring others to saving faith in Jesus Christ. Today's aim, facts, to show through the illustration of a wedding feast that we must do all we can to bring people to Jesus. Principle, to stress that as Christians we are obligated to tell others about Jesus. Application, to urge students to do everything they can to bring others to Jesus. Illustrating the lesson, we are called to go out and lovingly invite others into the kingdom by sharing the good news of Jesus as often as we can. Practical points. 1. God honors those who do not seek honors for them from people. Luke 14, 7 through 11. 2. God has chosen to use us as his ambassadors to invite the lost to salvation. Verses 15 through 17. 3. We should not be surprised if the gospel is met with excuses rather than joyous acceptance. Verses 18 through 20. 4. The despised and forgotten of the world are the objects of God's love. Verses 21 through 22. 5. We should make every effort to take the gospel to unbelievers, but ultimately they are responsible for how they respond. Verses 23 through 24. Golden text. And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. Luke 14:23. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is attitudes, Luke 14, 7 through 11. The second is opportunities, Luke 14, 15 through 20. And the third is decisions, Luke 14, 21 through 24. Introduction. The events recorded in Luke 14 took place at a banquet on the Sabbath day in the home of one of the chief Pharisees, verse 1. Among those gathered was a man with dropsy. Jesus looked around at the lawyers and Pharisees and asked, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath day? Verse 3. Jesus' question put them on the spot, because it was allowable, according to rabbinical interpretation, to give medical treatment on a Sabbath if a life was endangered. Everyone kept silent. The man's life did not seem to be at stake, but the religious leaders did not want to appear indifferent to the man's suffering by insisting that he could not be healed on the Sabbath. In the face of their silence, Jesus healed the man and sent him away. Jesus asked, Which of you shall have an ass or an ox fallen into a pit, and will not straightway pull him out on the Sabbath day? Verse 5. It was natural to rescue an animal that had fallen into a pit, no matter what day it was. Certainly they should not object to his helping a suffering human being. Attitudes, Luke 14, 7. And he put forth a parable to those which were bidden, when he marked how they chose out the chief rooms, saying unto them, verse 8, When thou art bidden of any man to a wedding, sit not down in the highest room, lest a more honorable man than thou be bidden of him. Verse 9. And he that bade thee and him come and say to thee, Give this man place, that thou begin with shame to take the lowest room. Verse 10. But when thou art bidden, go and sit down in the lowest room, that when he that bade thee cometh, he may say unto thee, Friend, go up higher. Then shalt thou have worship in the presence of them that sit at meat with thee. Verse 11. For whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. An observation, Luke 14:7. Jesus had already observed that the people at the banquet had been acting to preserve their own interests. As they entered the room, they evidently had been scrambling for the places of honor at the banquet table. The most honored places were those closest to the host, and Jesus had seen the maneuvering taking place to get into those seats of honor. Apparently, this was a rather important occasion, and everybody desired to be seen as being among those of special distinction. Even though this was apparently a fairly serious occasion, it must have been also comical to Jesus to watch the suitable attempts to get the best places without appearing too obvious. He knew that their values were completely misplaced and that there was a much better way to handle such a situation. The scene reminds us of a modern-day political scene where everybody wants to be as close as possible to the main person at the event. Who has not witnessed the big, often pasted-on grin of the observer standing nearby? There is going to be a good lesson for all of us here because of the natural propensity we have for self-promotion. One of the evidence of a self-centered person is that he goes out of his way to let others know how good, how talented, and how valuable he is. As Christians, it is far better to simply let others know our interests and then wait for the Lord to open doors instead of promoting ourselves. When God wants us involved in something, he will use it that the people in charge learn of our abilities. A wrong choice. Luke 14:8-9. Although Jesus was probably not at a wedding feast himself, he used that as his illustration, perhaps trying in a more sensitive and subtle way to let the people know how foolish they had been in securing their seats. Maybe nothing would happen this time to change the seating arrangement, but Jesus wanted to warn them that their assumptions in their scramble for the more prestigious seats could possibly lead to their embarrassment. The instruction he gave them was simple and straightforward. Jesus said that when a person was invited to a wedding feast, he should not assume that he should go to the best seat, for the host might have invited someone more deserving of that place. When the guest arrived, the host would come to him and ask him to move to another seat farther away. This would prove to be most embarrassing moment. The attempt of self-exaltation would turn into humiliation because of the public attention drawn to a person for the wrong reason. We could compare this today to a banquet head table, where the host and main speaker usually sit. Often included at this table are others who hold certain positions of authority in an organization. When you have been invited to such a special occasion, it is never safe to assume that you should seat yourself at the head table unless you have specifically been told to do so. An attitude of pride can lead to humiliating situations and does not please the Lord. A right choice. Luke 14:10-11. It is much safer for one to assume that he is simply one of the invited guests at the banquet and should sit wherever there is an open seat. Jesus said that one should go to the lowest place instead of the highest. If the host wants him to be in an honored position, he will come and invite the guest to sit in another seat. In the process, it will be publicly noted that he deserves special recognition. Instead of being embarrassed, he will be properly exalted before the other attendees. Jesus then verbalized a very important life principle. Whosoever exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted. Verse 11. The unsaved world cannot understand this principle. It happens because of God's control. The attitude of the world is to promote oneself and achieve recognition in order to be successful. God's desire is that we humble ourselves and let him do the exalting if and whenever he sees fit. Self-exaltation will ultimately result in humiliation. In the wedding feast situation, it was not the one who honored himself who was truly honored, but the one of the host honored. In spiritual terms, it is not the one who exalts himself who is truly honored, but rather the one whom God exalts. As God's children, it is far better to humbly carry out whatever ministry he has allowed us without seeking public acclaim. When we endeavor to exalt ourselves, we usually look foolish. But when God honors us in some way, we become a testimony to others of how he can use us effectively. Opportunities. Verse 15. And when one of them that sat at meat with him heard these things, he said unto him, Blessed is he that shall eat bread in the kingdom of God. Verse 16. Then said he unto him, A certain man made a great supper and bade many. Verse 17. And sent his certain servant at supper time to say to them that were bidden, Come, for all things are now ready. Verse 18. And they all with one consent began to make excuse. The first said unto him, I have bought a piece of ground and must needs go and see it. I pray thee, have me excused. Verse 20. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to prove them. I pray thee, have me excused. Verse 20. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Blessing. Luke 14:15. Jesus followed his teaching on humility with the teaching directed to those who host dinners, verses 12 through 14. He told them that they should not limit their invitations to those who have the ability to reciprocate, but should include those who are financially unable to do so. For this they would be blessed and rewarded by God himself at the resurrection. It was upon hearing this instruction that someone present spoke up with the pronouncement of blessing of his own. This particular guest did not really understand what Jesus had been teaching, and his statement sounds like a pious expression meant to impress Jesus. He seems to have connected in his mind the idea of being honored and blessed at a feast with the preposition that the purpose of people attending the wedding banquet had a lot to look forward to. There is a hint in his statement that he assumed every outwardly religious Jew would automatically be in the future kingdom. Such an understanding leads us to think that this man was one of the Pharisees. When Jesus mentioned that the resurrection of the just, verse 14, this man's mind went to the future kingdom. It may have been his understanding that when the Messiah came, he would deliver the Jews from the denomination of the Roman Empire. Then they would live in peace and prosperity without warfare and uncertainty. Undoubtedly, he was convinced that all Israelites would be there enjoying kingdom blessings. Invitations, Luke 14:16 through 17. In this parable, Jesus used the idea of a great supper to portray salvation, which results, of course, in becoming a part of God's kingdom. The invitations to the supper represent the invitation God has given to people to become part of his family through his son Jesus. Since it was clear to Jesus that the man who had just spoken did not understand salvation, he specifically addressed him in response to his comment about eating in the kingdom. In Jesus' parable, a certain man planned a huge dinner party and sent invitations to everyone he wanted to attend. It was customary to invite people well in advance of the event with an approximate starting time specified. When everything was ready, a servant went to tell those who accepted the invitation that it was time for them to come. Apparently, everyone had accepted the invitation, so the plans had been made accordingly. At this point, it would be extremely insulting to not show up for the event. Throughout the Old Testament, announcements were made that the Messiah was coming and that the Jews should be getting ready for his arrival. The announcements were received and accepted gladly. No one knew the exact time of his arrival, but it was certainly good news that he was coming, for he would provide deliverance for his people. The people of Israel were expectant and ready, or so they thought. Excuses, Luke 14:18 through 20. As the servant went from person to person to let them know it was time for the dinner to begin, he received many excuses as to why they could not attend after all. Every excuse reeked of insincerity. Each person indicated a preoccupation with other things that they considered more important than the dinner. The first said he had bought a piece of ground and needed to go see it. The second said he had bought 5 yoke of oxen and needed to test them. The third said he could not come because he had just got married. It is easy to see these are nothing more than excuses. Who would buy a piece of property without having seen it first? We have heard of certain scams involving the sale of unusable property to unsuspecting buyers sight unseen. But not many fall for that type of scheme. Likewise, who would invest in 5 yoke of oxen without knowing they were good, strong, and useful? As for the bridegroom, why did marriage suddenly prevent him from attending such an important function? The people's preoccupation with things they felt more important reveals a lack of interest in fulfilling the commitment they had made when they accepted the initial invitation. When the Messiah finally arrived in Israel, a large number of people were so involved with their everyday lives that they were not interested in hearing what he had to say. They paid little or no attention to the message he proclaimed. They were simply too busy and too involved in their normal activities to make any changes at that time. Decisions, verse 21. So that servant came and showed his Lord these things. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind. Verse 22. And the servant said, Lord, it is done as thou hast commanded, and yet there is room. Verse 23. And the Lord said unto the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. Verse 24. For I say unto you, that none of those men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. New invitations. Luke 14:21 through 22. When the servant returned and told his master about the excuses he had received, the master became angry and devised another plan. Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in hither the poor and the maimed and the halt and the blind, he said. The dinner was ready, and time was now of the essence. If those invited were so unappreciative that they would offer terribly lame excuses for not coming, invitations would go to those who would respond eagerly and be grateful for them. The master specified that the servant should go into the various areas of the city, both the broad streets and the narrow lanes, and invite the poor, maimed, crippled, halt, lame, and blind. The master had first invited those higher class, but he now turned to others when his invitation was rejected. In the eyes of the Pharisees, these people were outcasts, much like the tax collectors. In Israel, it was the religious leaders who first rejected Jesus and eventually saw to his death. They had an opportunity to receive him, but refused. Jesus therefore turned to the common people with his invitation. Since the religious leaders showed no interest in spiritual truth, Jesus went directly to the people with his teaching. The Gospels indicate repeatedly that this was where he received his greatest response. In Jesus' parable, the servant reported to his master that he had done as he was told. The people had responded and come, but there was still room left for many more. Expansion and exclusion. Luke 14:23 through 24. Since there was still room in the dining hall, the master told his servant to extend the parameters of the invitation. Now he should go beyond the city limits out into the countryside and invite people on the highways or around the hedges that acted as fences. He was to speak urgently to them, compelling them to come so that the master's house would be full of people. Persuasion was required, for this group would not feel worthy of such an invitation and needed to know that they were welcome. The master's concluding statement was a somber one. For I say unto you, that none of these men which were bidden shall taste of my supper. Verse 24. Those who had rejected his invitation would be excluded forever. Jesus' parable described his own offer of salvation for people to become part of the family of God. It remains true today that many reject the invitation while others accept it gladly. Just as the guest who pronounced the blessedness of those who eat in the kingdom of God did not understand how to get there himself, so there are many today who speak of God and heaven without an understanding of how to be sure of going to be with God after this life. We should willingly reach out with the good news to everyone we can. It is a message of utmost urgency. Questions. 1. What had Jesus observed as he watched the people coming in? 2. How did Jesus say they should act when attending such an event? 3. What principle did Jesus set forth regarding being exalted? 4. What lesson about self-exaltation can we learn from this? 5. What statement did one of the guests make to Jesus after this? 6. What was his understanding concerning the kingdom of heaven? 7. How did Jesus portray salvation in his parable? 8. What happened to the master in Jesus' parable after he invited a large group of guests to dinner? 9. What steps did he then take to fill his banquet hall with people? 10. How are many people today much like the Israelites of Jesus' day in their response to him? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, July 9th, 2023. Thank you for listening. God bless.